Why is Matt tuning the violin? And what does it have to do with this? Perhaps nothing, but it is everything. In order to understand the connection, we have to go back all the way 2,600 years ago to the year 570. That is the year Pythagoras was born. And he created the Pythagorean cult. See, Pythagoras discovered the notion that there is proportion between numbers, and some numbers are rational, some irrational. The other thing he discovered was tonality. The fact that every musical tone has a precise length of string that it produces under tension. And Pythagoreans like Nicomachus later on decided that mathematics is the language of the universe. Proportion and geometry govern everything. And these ideas were key to the High Middle Ages. You see, the European sword developed in a very unique set of circumstances that did not exist anywhere else across the world. Sure, there were battles here. Sure, there were fully armored combats. Knights and samurai, basically the same thing. And they were heavily armored. There were bows. There were firearms everywhere. But the European sword evolved in a rich tradition. What early Christians took from the Greek is the idea that the universe is knowable through the language, and that is the language of ideas and the language of mathematics. The medievals had a legend about Pythagoras specifically. They thought that he was walking by a house of the blacksmith and discovered music by hearing that different hammers make different notes on the anvil. In fact, that is how he's usually represented on cathedral architecture. But it goes beyond that. We might think that Pythagoras is a trivial character that someone mentions to you in high school and you try to forget. But in fact, he is everywhere around us. For the medievals, mathematics and music and proportion were the way the universe is arranged. That is the way the universe creates purpose. And they truly thought if they could replicate these perfect proportions in real life, that they will become closer to God. Every time you see a Gothic cathedral, that is proportion and that is music. If you don't believe it, all you have to do is open up Thomas Aquinas, and he uses music in comparison with mathematics and geometry as sister sciences in a way to know the world. The consequences of this view are actually very evident in modern time, and by modern, I'm saying beginning with the 18th century, that gave birth to the notion of science, that the universe is knowable through measurement, calculation, and experiment, that the universe is somehow fine-tuned to us understanding everything. Well, what does it have to do with swords? Well, absolutely everything. You see, if the Gothic cathedral is proportioned because medievals thought that the universe is arranged as if they're notes played by God, why shouldn't churches be arranged that way? Or rather, why isn't everything is ready for you to discover it through this type of worldview? You see, the European sword specifically, starting with the Middle Ages and all the way into the Renaissance, has a set of proportions built in, and you can hear them. You see, unlike everybody else, the Europeans accounted for tonality into the function of their sword. If you play around with swords, especially long swords, you notice that there are nodes, there are dead spaces on a sword where up over there you can block virtually any size weapon because it falls on a certain wavelength that the blade naturally has, a dead zone. However, you move it slightly and your sword becomes wobbly all of a sudden. Very annoying. But you can use that part in combat to slightly bend around an opponent's blade and have the sword flex right into their eye. See, that is intentional, and that way of seeing things could have only been produced in an environment where that is common knowledge. Well, it doesn't matter if the specific bladesmith knew Pythagoras all the way through and through. The atmosphere of the time, the general knowledge, the general attitude towards music and string instruments was all around. The craftsman was just a fish swimming in the ocean of Pythagorean knowledge. Consider, for example, the eternal katana versus longsword debate, where relative usefulness and features of each one are adjudicated against each other. However, one way of looking at it is that katana did not evolve in an environment that accounts for harmonics and musical proportion. And if you were to introduce harmonics and wave functions into the katana, it would destroy the whole sword. The European sword, on the other hand, is built for that purpose, to account for the harmonical movement in motion of combat. The anvil and the string are the parents of the European sword in a certain sense, because just this idea is completely captured in the architecture of the blade. Modern sword buyers always ask about the point of balance of the sword. However, we don't have any historical sources that mention points of balance very much. But a lot of sources compare geometries to music, and insofar as we know for a fact from using European swords that they are specifically designed with nodes and harmonics in mind, including the architecture of the tang, including how the pommel is attached, including the sizes and dimensions of guards, we know that this was an atmosphere. If you doubt it, let's think about how the medievals lived. And let's think about how they played music. See, music was highly regulated by the church. And troubadours who would play folk music would often get in trouble because they would play the chords that were prohibited, the chords that were thought to be unnatural. And it's only in the 18th century that those chords became legal to play in Europe. However, wealthy people, princes, princesses, noblemen, would gather up inside each other's palaces, and they would have jam session. And the jam session would sound like this. Someone gives a tune, and the other person catches it and creates a variation and a variation. It was a form of communication between intellectuals, and it was a form of communication that intellectuals and wealthy people would talk mathematics with each other. They would talk architecture through music. And God forbid you make a mistake and show yourself to be a fool. In fact, erudition about Pythagoras, about music and mathematics, was the key feature in the way Europe was built, starting around the 9th century at least, all the way into the Renaissance. If you have doubts that the medievals thought that music was written into the way the universe works, all the way until the 17th century, people thought that planets, each one of them has its own musical note, because it is at a musical note distance away from the Earth. And in the 17th century, Johannes Kepler thought that planets were divided from each other along orbits that circumscribe Platonic solids, which correspond to music. Music was physics for over 1,000 years, and physics was music. The key and absolute difference between the pagan world and the Christendom that started with Charlemagne is the following. While if you're in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, or China, you have this God and you choose to follow him, and as long as you respect the other ones, you're pretty much okay. Starting with Christianity, everything changed. Now you have a mandated religion that everyone had to subscribe to at the threat of death. Now, since the early years of Christianity, classical Greek knowledge has been absorbed and digested. St. Augustine attended a university already in the 4th century AD, where the 4 classical sciences were taught: mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. So the science of music was the science of the day. The notion of the music of the spheres was built in to the nature of reality as far as the medieval mind was concerned. And already by the time of the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, it was solidified as current dogma. So you could not build a building, design a palace, or make a sword without intentionally or inadvertently incorporating that worldview. To a certain extent, the medievals thought completely differently than we do today. They are like an alien civilization to us. But we do see echoes of that mindset. The mindset built by Greeks and redigested and produced by Christianity. Scientists nowadays are looking for the grand unifying theory of the entire universe. They're looking at it through the lens of mathematics, geometry, and abstract formulas. It is very much the same mindset that was produced already in the early years of the 9th century and in the beginning of the medieval era. So, when you pick up a sword, you see the history of your entire civilization from the beginning till today, right there in every artifact. It is perhaps no surprise that when Romans wrote about the sound of the battlefield, they would describe the sound of swords clashing as the sound of yew wood, rather than a song. But the medieval legends always describe a singing sword, the sound of singing steel. And here's why. The movement of the sword itself follows the harmonic function. Its entire architecture is designed around this function. And the function, art, and theology are all the same in this period. So, if I hold a sword like this, you see the pommel move, you see the tip move, and there are dead zones. So, if I hold a sword like this, there is no sound. This property, if you're using it in combat, provides you with an intentional, unintentional advantage. That is something that people originally did not intend to happen, but became part of the complete function of the shape. And that is, I can catch the heaviest sword possible using the nodes. Because the same thing happens in combat. So this is a weaker spot, but over here and over here, I can block heavy objects. But if I hit an opponent's weapon over here, my sword might just bend around past their defenses for a lethal strike. The latest research on historical medieval swords has shown that their flexiness, so to speak, does not come from the superiority of the heat treat or the material, as it was with China, Japan, or Europe. It was all folded steel that was shallow hardening. However, only European swords behave in a certain manner. And other cultures' swords intentionally do not behave this way. And the main reason for that is not because someone discovered a secret martial arts technique. No, it's because someone discovered Pythagoras. Obviously, there are many, many, many more factors that go into what creates a historical artifact. Famines, economic trade routes, depletion of resources, and other conditions. But we chose to focus on the aspect of the European sword that makes it unique and that is always overlooked because it is so ubiquitous and because music surrounds us every day. However, insofar as swords are historical artifacts and works of art, they communicate the values of the society that creates them the moment you pick them up.